Claire Zalc in a few words, and then I will basically ask the question that Professor Paxton wanted to ask, and I will throw a few of my own questions in the mix, but his questions are obviously extremely interesting and challenging, so I'm really going to follow his overlap. Should I speak closely to more? Okay, so I'm going to first introduce Claire Zalc, who is a research fellow, chargé de recherche at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent in Paris. I think one could identify Claire Zalc as a social historian. That is a subfield that has lost some of its prestige in the American Academy, but is currently completely renewed in France by a younger generation, of which I think Claire is one of the most important leaders. There are two major lines in her work. First is the history of immigration in France in the 20th century, and the second line of her strengths of her work is a strong interest in quantitative methods and statistics, combined with an acute attention to the construction of social categories and their impact on the production of statistics and their impact on the sources for the historians. These two lines of work are actually completely intertwined in her intellectual trajectory. She has written a book of her own, she has co-written 2 books, and she has edited 2 other books, so at a young age she has been already extremely prolific. Her first book is called Melting Shop, Une histoire des commerçants étrangers en France, and this is a version, actually a shortened version of her massive dissertation on the petits commerçants étrangers in Paris, mostly in Paris in the interwar period. And she co-authored with Claire Zalc here a book called Méthode quantitative pour l'historien, which was published in 2008 and has become the Bible of quantitative history. I see people voting here. I'm sorry? It's, so Méthode quantitative pour l'historien is quantitative methods for the historian, and which she co-wrote with Claire Zalc, and in which she presents really very, very usefully the way historians can use mathematics and statistics and quantitative methods to think about the past. And then she co-wrote with Nicolas Mario this wonderful book, Face à la persécution, 1999, so faced with persecution, 991 Jews during the war. And obviously this is the object of our conversation tonight, but before turning the conversation, I would like also to mention the catalogue of a huge exhibit that she organized in the Cité Nationale de l'Histoire de l'Immigration in Paris. That was in 2008. So that's the catalogue of the exhibit, and that's absolutely a wonderful document about the history of immigration in France in the 30s. So as you know, as you have noticed, Bob Paxton is not here tonight, he could not come here. He said his regrets, mentioning that Claire Zalc, I'm quoting him in the email he sent me, has written an extraordinary book. So I'm going to stand here for Bob Paxton and try to do justice to the questions he wanted to ask her and give a sense of his interest, his deep interest for this quite extraordinary book. So Claire, first of all, can you tell us a little about your approach, and can you explain to us what is microhistory and what can this approach tell us about the Holocaust that was not known before your work with Nicolas?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to present this work in Colombia, and thank you so much, Emmanuelle, for your introduction. I spent a year here 16 years ago with Emmanuelle, and we became friends at this time. And I'm really happy to come back to be there in the Maison Française. And most of all, I am very honored to be there and to present my work in front of you. I mean, it's true. And thank you, Shani, for inviting me to this prestigious occasion, and Emmanuelle as well. And to everybody, I would like to ask for your patience with my English. I can't give up my terrible accent, and I hope it won't be too hard to understand me. And if it's hard, please tell me, and I'm going to do my best to be to be as understandable as I can. So what is microhistory? That is a big question, and I don't want to spend too much time on historiography, but to briefly explain, microhistory came from Italian historians who, in the beginning in the 80s, delivered criticism of the prevailing methods in the field of history. Ginsburg, Giovanni Levi, and many of colleagues attacked large-scale quantitative studies on the grounds that they distort reality on the individual level. The microhistorians placed their emphasis on small units and how people conducted their lives within them. By reducing the scale of the observation, they argued that they are more likely to reveal the complicated function of individual relationships within each and every social setting, and they stressed its difference from larger norms. That is what we did with Nicolas Mariot when we decided to conduct an intensive survey among Jews from the city of Lens in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, a small town located in the north of France. Lens is an industrial city and has a long history of coal mining. I may tell you more about why we chose this specific city, but one of the main reasons was its size. There were around 1,000 Jews in Lens in 1939, so not a lot, which made it possible to do a micro-study of those Jews, or what one called in some kind of historical jargon, prosopography. In other words, we decided to track all the material that we could find on each of them. In other words, the approach in this work is to reconstitute as precisely as possible the trajectories of all of the Jews of Lens who were living there at the beginning of the war. How did we do this? You must all know the book from Daniel Mandelson, did you? Entitled The Lost, a search for 6 million. He attempts to rescue a single family's story from oblivion, digging into the details of their lives. Our survey has a similar ambition, but multiplied by 300. It is a story of 300 families, 991 people. Of course, our approaches are quite different. Daniel Mandelson is a novelist, and his work is literature. He's working on his own family, and his book is a reflection upon his relationship with his loss. We are not from Lens. None of us had relatives there, and our ambition is very much historical rather than personal. But our work consisted in tracking 1,000 people based on a wide range of sources and archives, and I could present you the sources if you want to. We tracked their name everywhere. Washington in the USHH archives, Auschwitz archives, Swiss refugee records, local French archives, national archives, and so on. Around 10 to 15 sources were compiled for each person, trying to reconstitute the past of those 1,000 Jews from 1940 to 1945. What for? I began my trajectory in the academic field in the 90s, at the moment when microhistory was very new and seductive to me. But is it not the main reason why I adopted this approach in this specific research? It is mainly because I believe that the methods of microhistory are extremely well suited for the study of persecution. Why? Sometimes we think we know something, but we know it only in the most abstract way, which means we may not know it at all. I can say it better than one of Daniel Mandelson's traveling companions does. The Holocaust, I'm quoting, is so big, the scale of it is so gigantic, so enormous, that it becomes easy to think of it as something mechanical, anonymous. But everything that happened because someone made a decision to pull a trigger, to flip a switch, to close a cattle car door, to hide, to betray. A micro approach allowed us to try to bridge this gap between the intensely personal and often literary approach to the Holocaust like Mendelssohn's, and the abstraction of large numbers, the collective fate of communities and larger populations. And we saw this as a gap in our understanding of the event. There were also a narrow historiographical basis for our choices. For a long time, history of Holocaust concentrated on the people and the process of Holocaust making, by which I mean a historical focus on the planners, implementers, executioners of the Holocaust. Victims had little place in this historiography for a pretty long time. Some described this as the silent era. Later, victims' experiences began to emerge in the form of testimonies, a development Anna Biewierka called the era of the witness. In the 1990s, survivor testimonies were incorporated into the larger narrative of the Holocaust, according it a privileged place in our understanding of mass killing processes. But what are we going to do now that survivors are dying for normal biological reasons? Our book is an attempt to find a new place for victims in Holocaust historiography outside of the traditional testimonies route. And that's why we use many archives on each of them, and we just forgot testimonies.
So your title comes to the number of 991. Why? How can you be sure that there were 991 Jews in Lens just at the beginning of the war?
So that is one of the main questions of the book, and that's why we put this number in front and in the cover and in the title. Because this is the main question: who is Jew? Or what is a Jew? Answers could be theological, philosophical, sociological. It is not easy to provide a simple answer to these questions. And to be honest, I wrote this book because I wanted to try to answer these questions in a historical way. What is a Jew? Who is Jew? The question of identity, as you told in the presentation, is one of the main interests of my historical research from the beginning of my trajectory. To summarize, there are two different ways to think about identity issue in the social sciences. Some scholars adopt a culturalist or a-socialist point of view, saying that identities are made by culture, ethnic belongings, language. To give a concrete example of this logic, Jews are the people who speak Yiddish, or in Lens, because they are from Poland, or frequent a synagogue, or eat special food, or listen to special music. Some other scholars defend the constructivist position that say that the identity is just a product of the identification process. You can remember the position of Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, who said that it is others who define someone as Jewish. The others regard, often the anti-Semitic regard. This definition was important in immigration historiography, where I come from. Beyond Brubaker, Noiriel, who worked on the importance of identification processes. But I was not satisfied with those two positions. Woody Allen helped me, of course. Yes, okay, you understand me. And I have to quote him because I am in New York. As he said, to be Jewish, one does not have to be schizophrenic, but it helps. I don't know if it is a schizophrenic way to answer this question, but I thought that the question of who is Jew was fascinating and had to be answered with specific historian tools. In order to identify the cohort of Lens Jews of 1939, we choose to use special sources. Usually, the researchers in France had three choices. First, to use the community sources, which are primarily religious and social, but which, regrettably, were lost because of the Holocaust there. Second, an analysis of surnames, which we reject on the grounds that they are not exclusive Jewish names, first, surnames, And most of all, because it is not the purpose of the research to say who is Jew and who is not. Such a research methodology would overdetermine our research sample, answering prematurely the very question that the research itself ought to answer. Third, to use the lists of Jews drawn up during and after the war. We try to invent a fourth solution, due to some very new archives. Nicolas and I pursued the project because we found some exceptional records in the department archives from the Jewish census of 1940. These were the letters addressed to public authorities by the Jews from Lens to declare themselves as Jews. The existence of these letters was unique and, in many respects, an accident of history, because in Paris and most other cities, Jews declared themselves directly to the authorities. In person, they came to the commissariat. There are no traces of the process. But Lens, however, was too far from the regional authority to permit easy travel. As a result, many declarations were made in writing, I mean most of all. I would like to quote from a few of the most interesting letters. In one, a father declares himself as Jew, I'm quoting, as a nationality, he wrote, but describes his daughter as French, because she is born in France. At around the same time, a woman wrote to the Béthune sub-prefect to explain her reticence in answering. She acknowledged being of Jewish origin, but she protested she was born French, of French parents, her father had been a volunteer in 1870 war, her husband in 1914, and her son in 1939. I'm quoting, I thus come to you to ask, Monsieur le Sous-Préfet, if, with all these French qualities, I must be classified among the Jews who are currently being investigated. By shedding light on French Jews' own self-representation, the letter is highly revealing. And so is the authorities' answer, which arrived a few days later. I'm quoting, because you were born as yourself declared to parents of Jewish origin, you belong to the Jewish race. Consequently, the petitioner had to declare herself to the Lens Town Hall. As this case demonstrates, the bureaucracy was completely indifferent to logical clarity and to ambiguity. It is very interesting to analyze the wide range of manners to declare one's Jewishness, which differed markedly from the statistical output made at the time and since. What did seem to filter down, however, were Vichy's notions about nationality and race. And we are able to conclude that the majority of Jews in Lens, 75%, self-identified, challenging the idea that the identification of Jews under Vichy happened via detection and was a continuation of Third Republic policies aimed at foreigners. That was not the case. But to go back on your question, at this point in our research, we had found 926 Jews in Lens. Yes, 926 was our starting number. In the list drawn up during the war and after the war, 926 names are mentioned, at least once. But we need not end the research there because we were interested in understanding what happened to those Jews. So we dug further for record, and then we found other Jews directly related to those 926. That was really a big surprise for us. I will just give you an example. We were almost sure that we knew everyone, and that was not the case. For example, Abraham Kleinhandler, we knew him pretty well because he was part of the 926 group. His name was on a lot of the list that we used. The list of Jews in Lens in December 1940, first census. the list of Jews present in Lens in January 1941, January 1942, the list of Jews who were given the Yellow Star in August 1942, the list of Jews arrested on the 11th of September 1942. We have in Lens our own 11th September because a very huge roundup in Lens took place on the 11th of September 1942. And the list of Jews arrested, the list for Convoy 10, which left the Belgian camp Malines to Auschwitz. That is the type of documentation that we use. But we assumed he was living alone with his wife, because he was always saying that he was married alone with his wife, and without any children. So it was very surprising when we found in the Yad Vashem testimonies a letter sent by a son, Joseph Kleinhandler. We discovered there that this child, Joseph, spent the whole war hidden. And this was not an isolated case. In the naturalization files, we found several hidden children, and sometimes even a wife or a husband who spent the whole war without being identified as Jew. From 926, the number grew to 991. To summarize, this number reflects the construction of a group, the Jews of Lens, a group made jointly by self-declaration and exterior identification. But the boundaries of this group are fluid. At the end of the book, we tell the story of a 992nd man that we found after we had completed our primary work. The manuscripts were over, it was sent to the publisher, and we found a 992nd man. It was not very funny, but so we wrote a very short epilogue, quick at the end of the book, telling the story of Joseph Strauss, an Austrian football player, soccer football player, who belonged to the very well-known in France Lens Racing Club de Lens in the 30s, and who was imprisoned in a French concentration camp in September 1939 because he was Austrian and considered as enemy when the war was declared. This man appeared on no list of Jews grown up during the war. So like any methodology, this one has its limits. Since the book was published, some other Jews of Lens contacted us, bringing our total up to around 1,000 people now. The research is not over, but the result is really important for me. There is no pure scientific definition of the Jewishness. And to the question, who is Jew, I decided to answer very pragmatically, trying to show what was to be Jew in a specific place at a specific moment. And that is my answer with this number.
Thank you. Can you get a little more into the details about what you learned about those Jews in France? Can you give us an overview? The book is, I must say, is constructed around chapters that look at specific steps in the trajectory during World War II. You have se déclarer, to declare oneself, to the authorities. Partir, which means to go, to leave the place, to return, to go back, to be arrested, to be deported, and all that. So, can you give us an overview of what happened, and can you also provide us with a few individual stories?
Okay, so we try to follow, as you say, the Jews living in Lens in 1939 step by step to understand the concrete life of people facing persecution. So, I am not going to say everything because it's too long, and I want you to read the book if you have.
And as I said, just to say, the book is extremely dense. I mean, you learn so much. I mean, like it's extremely rich. So she can read in a few minutes.
So I'm not going to tell you everything, but I will begin with the end of the story, and you know it pretty well. But I can tell you that the Jews living in Lens suffer much more than the average Jews in France. 487 from the city were arrested during the war. 467 were then deported and only 18 survived deportation. By the end of the war, the Jewish community of land had been reduced to around 500 people. This means that nearly half of Land's Jews were deported as compared to 25% of Jews in France as a whole. The statistics are interesting in themselves. Yet we must remember that each number represents a person who faced wrenching decisions and followed a unique path during the war years. The Jewish community in Lens was hit with full force. At the beginning of the war, the town's Jews faced several options, which we tried to retrace, as you say. Declare oneself a Jew or not. Embark on a new exodus or not. Return to lands henceforth located in a forbidden zone for refugees. Stay and get on with one's work, but at what risk? Sell one's capital holdings, but to whom? Or flee, but by separating from one another, and where could one go? These questions, which confronted each of the 991 Jews living in Lens, were nothing less than matters of life or death. We follow individuals from their identification as Jews, their flight from Lens, or their decision to stay, their disposition, and I can't pronounce this word, disposition when you know, okay? Their marking with a star, their arrest and deportation, their extermination at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and for some, their return to Lens after the war. So I'm not going to summarize the whole book, but just say that the originality of our approach is that we did not end the story at the boundaries of a geographical location, Lens. We followed the Jews of Lens through their subsequent lives and moves. We found that living in 1940 did not lead to permanent safety. Some would be trapped in later roundups and deportation. The Jews who stayed in or returned to Lens were soon confronted with an ever-growing list of discriminatory measures. Our general conclusions are compatible with most of the writing of these issues, but the microhistorical approach helps to understand in precise detail the impact of the Holocaust. For example, detailed lists of all of the carrots, beets, potatoes, and leeks taken from the gardens of Jews who had been arrested and deported, and lists of all of the goods taken from their apartments starkly demonstrate the extent to which persecution had reduced most of Lens Jews to destitution. A particularly hard part of the research process involved following the Jews during the deportation process. Thanks to the opening of new archives, the Bad Arolsen record digitalized by the United States Holocaust Historical Museum 2 years ago, we tried to describe what happened to those Jews from their arrival at Auschwitz until their death there. I think 467 were deported, and 108 were registered and held at Auschwitz camp. That means that more than 75% went immediately to the gas chambers. Of the 108 Jews from Lens who were registered and held at Auschwitz camp, 84% died. Among those whose date of death is known, a quarter died in the first month and 85 by the end of 4 months. Only 7% survived longer than a year. At this time of the research, we did not search for names anymore in the archives, but for numbers. The serial numbers given to the Jews entered in the camp and tattooed on their arms. In Auschwitz, the person became numbers. I am giving you a lot of percentages here, but this research had also a qualitative side. And you ask for individual story. stories, so I will give you one. The Mendelevich family. There were 3 brothers and 1 sister, all married. One brother, Isaac, stayed in Lens with his wife and his daughter, Henriette. The wife was arrested during the summer 1942 and placed in a prison for women. But Isaac and Henriette, 10 years old in 1942, Henriette, were all 2 arrested in the huge round-up of September the 11th of 1942. Isaac and Henriette were sent to the camp of Malines in Belgium and then deported to Auschwitz on the convict of September the 15th, convict 10. They did not enter the camp and went directly to the gas chamber. Sura, the wife and mother, survived, came back in Lens in 1945 and stayed there as a garment worker, culottier. Then the sister, Toba, married David Rosenthal and had 3 children. They all self-declared in 1940. They are the only ones from the Mendelevich family who did so. Toba was arrested and deported like her husband and 2 of the children of the same convoy. Harry Chaim, born in 1929 in Lodz, and Bina, born in Amsterdam in 1936. The only survivor was the last child, Nathan, born in Lens in 1937. He was not arrested and we lost his trace. David Rosenthal, the father, survived Auschwitz. Toba and the children were sent directly to death, but David was sent with a commando unit to Warsaw to clean up the ruins of the ghetto from October 1943 to August 1944, with 3 other Jews of Lens. Then he was sent to the Dachau. He was still alive in August 1944. We don't know much about the second brother, Sigismund. He was living in Lens, 65 Rue de Crombec, with his wife and 1 child, according to the list of the Israelites who lived in Lens and left the town since May 1940. Then he disappeared from the records. They were not arrested because they are not in any of the deportation lists from France and Belgium. Undoubtedly, they were hidden somewhere in France and changed their identities. The last brother, Max, had no children. He married a woman named Paula, and both left Lens in 1940. They went to Toulouse and stayed there for 2 years before managing to escape to Switzerland in October 1942, joining Paula's parents, who were living there. In the end, Switzerland was the only safe location. 55 Jews of Lens succeeded in crossing the borders as clandestine immigrants. All 55 survived. In 1945, Sura came back to Lens alone. She lost her daughter Henriette and her husband. She tried to get a death certificate from the police for them, but had great difficulty establishing their fates. Max came back too and became the head of the local UJRE, Union des Juifs pour la Résistance et l'Entraide, a socialist Jewish organization. What can we conclude from these stories? The trajectories of the Mendelevich family show how difficult it can be to generalize from one case to the others, to interpret choices and decisions made by the different households facing the persecution. One single family, 4 couples, and so many trajectories, so many choices, so many paths, outcomes, decisions. Reconstructing networks of acquaintanceships, family trajectory, and the variety and complexity of individual itineraries makes it possible to study the Holocaust from below. Whatever the scale of observation, variety, diversity is the main conclusion of this story. One of our goals is to try to give some keys to understanding these different actions and outcomes. This approach is sometimes called prosopography, and refers to documentation of the victims' beliefs and knowledge in light of their social networks, groups of affiliation, and biographical trajectories. And that's what we try to do, and not just tell some individual stories.
Yeah, so actually about this relationship between the individual stories and the broader picture, can you tell us what you are expecting from quantification? In a way, it seems a little contradictory to combine microhistory with quantification. Microhistory is actually about individual stories, trajectories, and quantification is about groups. So how do you combine those two, and what do you get from that?
So the aim of our work is to approach the dilemmas faced by the Jews in Lens, not as psychological phenomena, but rather as choices dependent not only on the particular context, but also on the social and demographic characteristics of those who made them. So we need quantification for that. Family configuration, structure of group affiliations. Here lies, I hope, the book's originality. That is why we choose to use statistics to explain circumstances that we usually associate with the singularity of suffering. We explicitly aim to quantify information while emphasizing the heterogeneity of Jewish experiences in Lens. It is a manner of understanding the Shoah, while at the same time expanding a conception of social history and its method. We try to prove that it is possible to undertake a sociological informed analysis of behavior during a genocide, and especially during a war. The quantitative approach allows us to give some results that are not observed on a strictly individual level. Most of all, we try to explain how the social circumstances weighted on the individual choices people made in response to persecution. For example, we could identify the main characteristics of the people who decided to stay in Lens and the people who decided to go. What is a matter of risk perception, of wealth? I can ask you the question, what do you think? Because when I'm going to say the result, you're going to say, okay, that's why. Well, but you don't know. Why? Who are the people who are staying? Who are the people who are leaving? What is the main characteristic?
People left to get relatives or friends to stay elsewhere? No?
I would say the origin, if people, the Jews were French or they were considered as, they were not naturalized.
No, that was the main thing. I mean, everything played a role, but that was not the main thing, yeah.
A disbelief that it couldn't happen to them.
Yeah, but that's hard to measure. The main thing was,
if an individual is 1/8 Jewish, he was considered Jewish.
What? I didn't
If
understand.
an individual is 1/8 Jewish.
Half Jewish.
1/8.
Those people who left were
One grandparent.
just one. They were not considered as Jewish.
They were considered Jewish.
You have to have 3 grandparents Jews.
3 grandparents.
3.
Of course.
Yeah.
Or half if you're married to a Jew.
Yeah. That was the Vichy.
That's the Vichy law.
Yeah. Now, you know what? The biggest thing was the size of families. The more children you have, the more likely you are to stay. Yeah. But no one found before the quantification. That helps. I mean, the question is really important because stay in Lens meant die for almost everyone. As I told you, the roundup in Lens was terrible. According to the census made after it, in October 1942, there were just 13 Jews in Lens. Before September 11th, there were 300 still registered there. So let me back up a little to explain this result. We examine the impact that a family's social and legal status had on the decisions to stay or flee, and on the odds of survival. As the danger grew, women and the most vulnerable residents began to flee. However, the larger the household was, the greater the likelihood of remaining in Lens was. During flight, isolation played a protective role. Conversely, when one considers the number of arrests, dense kinship networks could be a burden. One could generalize this insight to conclude that whereas in peacetime, family connections can be an asset, notably for Jewish immigrants, they become in times of danger a liability, as instance of separation suggests. I can give you some other example of the importance of the quantitative approach, but I don't want to be too long because I see the time is running. So, as you see, microanalysis here on a small town is totally compatible with qualitative history. And this is also very compatible with a lot of narratives.
Okay. So, actually, as a follow-up from this, one of the major questions that is raised by the approach of microhistory is how typical the case is. In one way, it's Lens, a very specific case. It's also a very specific location. We haven't really made this very clear at the beginning, but Lens is in the it's not in the general occupied zone. It's in North Pas-de-Calais, and that's actually directly. You explained that at the beginning in a contextual chapter. It's directly administered through Belgium, through the German in Belgium. So there are French authorities, there are French policemen who are doing the work of arresting people, but also they're very, very closely controlled by German authorities, more so than in Paris, let's say, or in the other, in the general occupied zone. So in a way, Lens, by its geographical location and the fact that the German authorities are more present, and also more generally because you are looking at a specific place at a specific time, how can you generalize that? What does Lens tell us about the trajectory of Jews in France at the time between 1940 and 1944, or even in Europe? What is the generalization factor?
Microhistory tends to focus on outliers rather than looking for the average individual determined by the application of quantitative research methods.
Mm-hmm.
Microhistory is a point the term normal exceptions is often used to characterize this perspective. It means that none of us show our full hand of cards. Seeing what is usually kept hidden from the outside world, we realize that our focus has only been on the normal exceptions. Those who, in one segment of society, are considered obscure, strange, and even dangerous, they might be in other cycles at the center of attention and fully accepted in their daily affairs. My point is that Lens, you're totally right, is not at all representative of France. As I said, nearly half of Lens Jews were deported, as compared to 25% of Jews in France as a whole. Our purpose was not at all to choose a representative tone, but to write the story from below. The question is to understand why Lens is not representative. That is our main question. How can we understand the incredible harshness of the persecution there? There could be three main reasons. First reason, the number of foreigners among the community. As at the national level, the deportation rate was 17% for French Jews and 43% for foreign Jews. In Lens, these rates were respectively 35% for French Jews and 59% for foreign Jews, which suggests that nationalities still offer protection, but less than the national average. And this is a consequence of the status of Lens. Part of the forbidden zone, Lens was considered by Germans as part of the Belgian territory. The only national Jews in Lens there were Belgian Jews. French Jews were considered as foreigners because Lens was annexed to Belgium. After the terrible roundup of September 1942, there were, as I told you, 13 Jews left in Lens, all were Belgian Jews. Secondly, all of the anti-Semitic measures were enforced vigorously by the authorities at Lens. Leading police officials were very aggressive and thorough in carrying out censuses of the Jewish population, enforcing economic and financial discrimination, imposing the Yellow Star, and rounding up and arresting Jews for deportation. The police commissioner of Lens, Mr. Humetz, seemed very receptive to the German orders and sometimes got ahead them. He anticipated them. Third, there were virtually no evidence of Jews finding sympathy or support from the non-Jewish population of Lens, possibly because they were seen as foreigners and economic rivals. Polish miners, the clients of a large part of the community, were not helpful at all. The number of righteous among the nations in the Pas-de-Calais is one of the lowest in France. So the issue is not to see Lens as a representative case. To put it in other words, I am not a disciple of Ernest Labrousse, who held a chair at the Sorbonne in the 60s and established this model of economic and social history. The result of that work took the form of dozens of detailed monographs conceived of as pieces of a vast puzzle, that could eventually reveal a complete image of the economic and social history of early and modern France. My conception is really totally different. I think the adoption of a more fine-grained focus affects the writing and the methodology of Holocaust studies. A micro approach elicits new objects and questions, identification mechanisms, the arealization of properties, the impact of neighborhood relationship and of proximity, and so on. The questions of representative became not relevant anymore.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to quote explicitly from one of Robert Paxton's question, who was mentioning this article published in Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the winter of 2006 by Marnix Kroes, entitled, so the title of the paper is The Holocaust in the Netherlands and the Rate of Jewish Survival. And in this article that Professor Paxton was comparing to your work, the author basically questions all the factors for survival. What are the factors in the specific situation that made survival more or less likely? And so the author was quoting the German efforts, the intensity of the German effort, the local aid to the German effort, the local anti-Semitic attitudes, the possibilities of rescues, and so on and so forth. So Professor Paxton was making the point that you work there and Nicolas Mario's work on Lens may contribute to that effort to understand and prioritize the reasons for more or less survival. What do you have to say about that?
So the questions were really good and very nice, because comparing my work to this article was really nice. And this article is very important in my trajectory, because this article allowed us to do some quantification on this specific subject, which was not easy. To quantify dead people, to quantify victims of the Holocaust was not an easy way to do. And this was sort of a pioneer article about that. But the most important contribution is to promote a new way to work on the Holocaust process using all the traditional methods of historians. And I am convinced that the methods of social history can be applied to objects of research that, due to their exceptional character, are also objects of intense debates and contentions. And if you can permit this reference to Professor Paxton, this is also what I learned from his own work on Vichy. There is no reason to write the history of this period with some other tools than the other historians. That's exactly what he did when he just looked at this wonderful archive and just used the specific tools of historians. So, what is interesting in this specific article is to speak about survivors and dead people and to ask the question of who survived and why. To be honest, the thing is that I'm not sure the regression logistic don't live. The regression logistic model is the only way to answer this good question. To simplify, logistic regression is a type of regression analysis statistic method used for predicting the outcome of a binary dependent variables based on one or more variables. For example, logistic regression might be used to predict whether a patient has a given disease based on observed characteristics of the patient, age, gender, body mass, results of various blood tests, and everything. Another example might be to predict whether a voter will vote Democratic or Republican, Sarkozy or Hollande if you prefer, based on age, income, gender, race, state of residence, votes in previous elections, and so on. So that's what Forrest did about survival. What we observe in laws is that this is nonsense to reduce the persecution process in its only result, survive or not. There are a lot of steps during the process of persecution, and each of them is determined by factors which vary from step to step. To be more concrete, the declaration process is determined mainly by age. Young people are not declaring themselves. The more older you are, the more declaring yourself you are going to do. The living class process, by the size of the family, as we saw together. The Aryanization process by nationality. The deportation process by location and address. For example, the gender doesn't play any role until the very end. At the end, this is the most important variable to understand among those who were sent to Auschwitz camp, who survived and who did not. 15 men came back and just 3 women. So there, the gender is the variable. This shows you how the process of persecution can't be, from my point of view, just analyzed as a final result, to survive or not, but should be understood as a trajectory. Therefore, my goal is now to work on the formalization of the different trajectories of persecution, speaking of the quantitative approach. But I'm not going to use a regression model.
So can you tell us a little more about your location within the historiography? Have other historians used a similar approach to yours? And can you give us a few examples of current research that would be similar to yours?
I'm not at all alone doing this microhistory of Holocaust. We are a lot. Unfortunately, we are a lot. Over the past decades, students of the destruction of the European Jewry have explored numerous terrains of investigation. The perspectives deployed on these terrains have ranged from cross-national studies to monographs and biographies. And more recently, researchers have adopted a more micro-focused investigating groups of perpetrators, family trajectories, deportation convoys, the history of a ghetto, a camp, a city, or a region. I wanted to quote 2 recently published major books from my point of view about this period, which all adopt a micro approach. Christopher Browning, for example, in his last book entitled Remembering Survival, and he's going more micro, more bottom-up, and he's studying the Holocaust in the camp of Starowice. I don't know if you know it. I'm not going to do so a lot, but he is able to paint a detailed picture of Jewish survival strategies. And what I want to say here is that one of the main goals of the micro approach is to integrate strategies and agencies into the historical writing of the Holocaust. That is an important point. In regard to the Jews of Lens, from Lens, one of the questions is, for example, did they leave the town during the war or not? And the answer is not mechanical. It is not easy to know why and when to leave if you do so. Who are the Jews who left and who are those who stayed? On a macro level, one can observe the simple result: if you stay, you die. But the process of making the decision could be observed better on a micro level. Let's see another example. I am thinking of the recent work of Omer Bartov, that you must know, of course. His goal is to trace the origins of genocide in the complexity of inter-ethnic relations over a long time span in a little town, Buchach, located in eastern Galicia. The population of this town is mixed Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian, and Bartov tries to understand the eradication of its Jewish inhabitants by Nazi murder squads, assisted by local collaborators, and the ethnic cleansing of its Polish population by Ukrainian nationalists. To my point of view, the delimitation of a terrain of investigation means the possibility of reconstituting the logic of a social space and the decision facing individuals embedded in this space. Monographs like his significantly highlight the dynamics of social relations among victims, executioners, and bystanders. This contribution focuses on interactions, and that is one of the main points of microhistorical approaches. And the last point is the issue of sources and archives. I am currently organizing a big conference on microhistory of the Holocaust, which is going to be held in Paris next December. We put out a call for papers, and guess what? We received more than 150 proposals. The renewal of interest in new archival records due to the opening of new files since 1989 is very impressive, and I'm waiting a lot. I hope I can speak better of that after the conference.
So actually, what are you working on right now? Are you using a microhistorical approach in your current work? And you have, big projects with big questions and big methodological breakthrough, as in with this book.
Okay, I have to, as I told you, I have to work further on the formalization of the trajectories of persecution, and I want to try to think, going to help me, about the possibility of modeling persecution. This is a challenge for historians, and moreover for historians like me, who are interested in the ways of doing and writing history. But I have also a brand new project. Brand new. So very at the right beginning, very beginning. And one of your colleagues, Rebecca Cobrin, professor at Columbia, was very important to me in deciding that it was not totally insane. It's a little bit insane, but I would like to look at all of the Jewish people of a Polish town, a shtetl, starting at the beginning of the 20s, and track them all over the world until the 50s. Yeah, I say it's insane, but she thinks it's okay. So my big question is to understand how the Holocaust affects the hierarchy and the organization of a community within migration, genocide, deportation, and reconstruction. I will try to follow each member of this 3,000 people community to build a trajectory model. And what is really exciting about this new project is that I don't know the answer at the beginning. That's what I like in history, when you don't know the answer at the beginning. I really don't know what I'm going to find. Does the Holocaust change everything? Does the migration protect more than any other pattern? That is not sure, as the French case showed. To migrate in France did not mean escape from persecution. Who is moving where? The second virtue is that it will bring me to a lot of places. Argentina, Australia, Swiss, United States, Israel. But the language poses difficulties, and I have a lot to learn, so I hope I will be able to present some results of this new project in, let's say, a couple of years, maybe 10 years, because it will surely take me a long time to do it.
So we hope that this will be in Columbia. Claire said she was here 16 years ago. I think we hope that's going to be before 16 years. So we're going to stop the questioning now, and I'm going to reiterate what Professor Paxton said about your book, which is a quite extraordinary book, as you know, demonstrated by this extremely interesting presentation. So we're going to now have we have some